Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous reconciliation tonight, because I think it's an issue that we really need to spend a little bit more time considering. And I had dinner a week ago and met a gentleman by the name of Alex Bishop. Alex Bishop is an experienced business leader who uses a consultative and collaborative approach. His mission is to affect change by propelling economic reconciliation. He's been very involved in Indigenous issues and other political issues in the past, and he does this by uniting Indigenous and non-Indigenous stakeholders on key issues. His recent projects include work with the First Nations University of Canada, creating a National Indigenous Economic Institute, bringing in Kitigan, Zibi, and Six Nations to bid for the Ottawa Senators, creating $200 million in overdose prevention funding, and raising more than $300 million in equity. Alex, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
My pleasure to have you. So tell me, how did you get involved in Indigenous issues and Indigenous reconciliation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm non-Indigenous, so it's sometimes a question for a lot of folks who don't know me. And I guess the journey started, about 15 years ago or so. I got sober from a bunch of substances, and through that process was able to create the naloxone program in Ontario. And that program brought me doing a lot of media work, the CBC morning shows particularly, where I actually got by accident outed for being in recovery. And you know how the producer does the pre-interview and then the host usually does the on-air portion. Well, there was a miscommunication between the two. And as a result, I went from being very closeted about being in recovery, but very passionate about it, to ending up being forced to deal with a very public situation of being a sober guy. And that actually had me do a lot of work working with First Nations communities, because there's an overrepresentation of almost every possible substance issue with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And so a lot of the chiefs and councils knew me from doing pro bono work. And then they realized, well, you're actually a Bay Street guy. You do finance for a living. Can you help us with our problems, with accessing capital? And how can we create more jobs in our communities? How can we partner with non-Indigenous businesses? So it was not thought out. It was not planned. It was very accidental. So now I get to spend a lot of my time working with chiefs and councils. I work with a lot of their business leaders, and I get to help bring wealth and job opportunities to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities.
Fantastic! What an interesting, profession, and a fascinating way that you sort of got into it. Maybe we could take a step back, and you could tell me a little bit about. You said that a lot of issues came out of this whole process of addictions, and that you were challenged by that, and there were a lot of Indigenous people who are challenged by that. Tell me a little bit about your own personal experience, if you could.
Yeah, sure. It's growing up, I had maybe not the best childhood. My father was not the nicest human being, smart guy, but never really took ownership of his failings, and took it out on myself and my mother. So like a lot of women who are dealing with domestic violence, we did the midnight move and moved from Toronto, where we spent some of my childhood, out to the rural Ontario, and grew up there. Never really dealt with issues around self-worth, and discovered booze and some other substances along the way, and that kind of quelled a lot of my demons. And pretty successful. Did a bunch of businesses, and thought that was going to be the thing to make myself feel better and make myself okay with me. And it wasn't. And so finding drugs and burning my life down along the way, discovered I got to do things differently, and my approach to living wasn't the right approach. So discovered this whole world of sobriety and really a purpose-driven life through that, and being of service to other people versus trying to just make money and fill my own emotional cup. So it was a great it was probably one of the greatest gifts I ever got, was actually being an addict.
What? The greatest gift you ever got was being an addict?
Well, because what it did was it really forced me to look inside and realize that I wasn't doing things appropriately. My life I was running amok. And so the process of being in recovery and actually working on my own stuff became a huge asset from where it was originally, which was a huge liability. So, there's the saying that rock bottom became the bedrock in which I rebuilt my life, and I really ascribe to that.
How did you sort of go from addiction to post addiction? Did you go through rehab? Did you go through some people talk about it, you got to hit bottom first. Like what was the process?
Yeah, I think bottom is a concept of just when you're done, when you're finished trying to do things a certain way. So there can be bottoms that are really high bottoms where people are not losing everything in their lives. There's some cases where people are like me and they're suicidal, and that becomes the impetus for change. But I was in and out of 12-step programs since before I was legally able to drink, and never really made that stick. And so my pathway to getting sober was through the rooms of 12-step programs.
And did you go to rehab or just AA or what?
Yeah, I never did the rehab thing. It was something that I had some means, I had some pretty well resourced, and so was able to have therapists and people around me to help me deal with the underlying issues of why was I an addict and why did all that happen. And so was luckily able to do that without having to separate myself from the world for 30 days, 60 days, or 6 months.
I know someone in rehab right now, and in the program are numerous different other Indigenous people, and he's actually finding the connection with the Indigenous community really powerful. And I guess he did just this week a smudging ceremony and some other things. Tell me a little bit about the challenge of addiction within the Indigenous community and some of the, if you could, the spiritual aspects of the Indigenous community.
Yeah, so there's, as you know, it's not a monolith of one Indigenous community. There's more than 600 nations across this country, and so a lot of them have very unique approaches to spirituality. But there's a general situation that's going on with Indigenous people in this country where there's a overrepresentation of addictions, of mental health illnesses, and if you think about why that's the case, there's 400 and some years of people being subjugated by British North America and then more recently Canada. Every single measure of socioeconomic health and wealth, Indigenous people in this country are at the absolute bottom. Highest rates of diabetes, of heart disease, the highest rates of childhood poverty, the highest rates of malnutrition, the highest rates of issues that really stem from a lack of access to what the rest of us in Canada would just be thinking is normal. Clean drinking water, clean places that shelter over our heads, and food that's of a suitable quality. So you've got a situation where there is a pandemic of addictions that are
Pandemic.
Yeah. If you look at addictions rates, they are quantums higher with First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities. And it's something that's really not being dealt with. There are some chiefs that I work with where more than 50%, he says, more than 50% of his members are addicted to some substance. And that's absolutely terrifying. How do we move ahead as a society when that's the case? So, you were talking about spirituality and how that looks. There's smudging. So, using sage as a way of cleansing oneself is a most communities will, and most Indigenous people will use a tool like that as a way of spiritually cleansing themselves. And it's a fantastic ceremony. There's certainly a stronger relationship with spirituality for Indigenous people than non-Indigenous people. And a lot of it has to do with a real strong connection to the land and community that I think a lot of us in outside of Indigenous circles are actually looking for, is that real sense of connection. But certainly without the basic things that the humans need, food, water, shelter, then it doesn't matter how strong one's spirituality is. It's really hard to be healthy.
I can imagine. You currently do this reconciliation work, and you do it through a company by the name of Concierge Group. Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm an owner of that. I'm also a partner in a couple other companies. One's TAG. It's a Ottawa-based professional services group. And what we do is we advise First Nations organizations. We advise First Nations University of Canada. There's a new chief, national chief, who we're doing some work with as well from the Assembly of First Nations, as well as a number of individual chiefs and councils.
And if people want to make use of any of your expertise in what Indigenous relations and reconciliation, is there a website that they should go to?
They can just Google me, Alex Bishop. Go to alexbishop.com. You can find a good way to connect with me that way, and learn a little bit more. And frankly, if that's something that someone's interested in, it's a real competitive advantage if you're a business person and you want to have a competitive advantage. Having an Indigenous approach to things is one of the smartest things you can do.
I was in Vancouver, this week, looking at some real estate development opportunities, and people said you can't develop in the Lower Mainland unless you have a good strategy in regards to Indigenous relations and good relations with the Indigenous communities, because they have got land claims, substantial land claims, and they are very involved from an economic development standpoint in the real estate business. And I bet you this is a lot more pervasive across Canada than just the Lower Mainland of Vancouver, but it certainly came up in every meeting I had.
Yeah, it's certainly the central issue in real estate development in the Lower Mainland. There's a number of communities. One of them is Tawasin that has very strong land claims, but there's multiple communities there that are very much see that their path out of poverty is through real estate development, with proximity to Vancouver and a lot of the other Lower Mainland BC communities. But it's certainly, to your point, it's a lot more broad than just simply real estate development or simply the Lower Mainland BC. There's a piece of legislation that Canada signed called UNDRIP, UNDRIP. It's the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. And it's being made into law. And essentially what this piece of soon-to-be legislation is doing is it will make it such that anyone who's doing business in Canada on Indigenous land, which is all of Canada, they're going to have an Indigenous partner for that business to go ahead, whether that's a real estate development project or whether it's a hydro wire line, a mine, or infrastructure, and even more broadly outside of that. And we can see that in tourism and a lot of other sectors. So having a lens where you're thinking, as a business person, how do I outcompete my competitors? One of the things you can look at is building in Indigenous approaches. And having Indigenous partners is something that I've seen time and time again actually makes business go faster. One of them actually you're very familiar with is with the Ottawa Senators. When we went through that, one of the groups that I was working with was trying to acquire the Senators, and I'm very happy that Michael Andelauer won the bid. He seems like a really good guy. If we're not going to get it, then it should be someone who's a good human being, and he seems like a really solid guy. One of the things that we did is that we brought in, very intentionally, the local community, and one of the local communities, Kitigan-Zibi, First Nations there. And we saw that as being the right thing to do, but it was also, from a business perspective, incredibly advantageous for us. So Kitigan-Zibi becomes an equity investor in our bid to acquire the Senators. As a result of that, other nations came in, and they came in with very substantial amounts of money. Once that news became public, the people in the local Ottawa community knew that there were some land claims that were unsettled in Ottawa. and that some of them had to do with First Nations. And if the First Nation could be a part of this senator's bid, then there could be an opportunity to redevelop some of the land at a much faster pace. So what happened, we brought in the Kitigan-Zibi into our bid, and then a lot more capital flew and flowed into our bid. So it's one of those situations where having Indigenous partnerships is not only the right thing to do, but it's also a good business move.
Good for business. Sounds good. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Alex Bishop. We're going to talk a little bit more about residential schools, about reconciliation, about whether this is important for Canada, and what Alex thinks we need to do. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. The topic tonight is Indigenous reconciliation and doing business with Indigenous groups, and providing the economic development opportunity for some of those Indigenous organizations that do want to co-invest alongside us. Stay with us, everyone. We'll back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is Indigenous reconciliation. My guest is Alex Bishop. Alex is an experienced business leader. He says he utilizes a consultative and collaborative approach with a mission to affect change by propelling economic reconciliation. He does this by uniting Indigenous and non-Indigenous stakeholders on key issues. He's worked with First Nations University of Canada, created a National Indigenous Economic Institute, bringing Kitigan, Zibi, and Six Nations groups together to bid for the Ottawa Senators, and raising more than $300 million in equity from Indigenous organizations. Sounds like a very successful strategy. Alex, let's take a big step back, if we could. You know, we talked about your own personal situation. Let's talk about sort of our national situation. Some people have said sort of that slavery was the original sin of the United States. Is how we've treated our Indigenous people one of those big mistakes in Canada historically?
Yeah, it's historical and it's current. And when you look at how this country was settled by non-Indigenous people, it was really done at the backs of Indigenous communities. It was done very intentionally, and it was done non-intentionally as well. The non-intentional part was certainly due to the some of the diseases that Europeans brought to this continent, and it was done very intentionally with relocating entire communities, and we're talking hundreds of communities and millions of people who were forced to relocate right across this continent directly as a result of prioritizing and racist decisions that were made by governments.
This truth and reconciliation process that we've gone through, and numerous different recommendations on what we should do. Have you reviewed that? Have you been involved in that? What do you think of it all?
Well, there's a number of recommendations that have come out of this. Most of my work is dealing with, in fact, almost all of my work is dealing with the economic side of reconciliation. What we can see is from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we can see that there's clear and chronic issues that are in place due to Canada being completely racist in the decisions that they've made. We have a railroad company, CN, that recently lost its entire Indigenous advisory group because they were and currently are unwilling to apologize. You know, reconciliation is this concept of acknowledging of harms done. And if we can't acknowledge harms done, then there's certainly no way that we can create healing and moving past that. So a number of the recommendations that have come about from the TRC include Canada making direct reparations to First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities for everything from residential schools to clean drinking water, to providing an inadequate amount of funding for education, to forcibly removing people from land. And so a lot of the recommendations have to do with trying to set things right. And, frankly, it's going to be very difficult to do it. We're currently sitting in a situation, according to the Assembly of First Nations, where there is a deficit between schools and roads and all the different pieces of infrastructure, a deficit of $350 billion in First Nations communities across this country. That's a huge amount of money.
$350 billion that we need to invest in infrastructure to bring it up to what, a Canadian standard or something like that?
Yeah, just the standards that you and I would expect. And that's not going to happen without having a serious rethink that government has in terms of what its role is, and then also having private partners provide a role, because $350 billion, even over a 10-year period, is a gigantic sum of money for Canadians to invest in. And how any government can make that happen would really it would take a significant shift in how governments are actually operating with First Nations.
Why don't we have clean drinking water at Indigenous communities?
Well, I mean, the answer is it's complicated. A lot of it has to do with a dramatic underfunding of drinking water systems. Everything from where the water is sourced from. Very often it's contaminated due to non-Indigenous businesses. I can think of 36 communities that have had drinking water issues directly as a result of mining companies that have allowed substandard environmental standards to create leaching of chemicals into and tailing ponds and all these kind of things into the drinking water of the communities. There is some issue around a not enough workers in the area to be able to fix the problem fast enough. So very often these communities are remote, and so being able to get good staff on site to be able to rebuild or build new drinking water facilities is an issue. But a lot of the communities are close by. There was a class action that was settled last year, and the lead plaintiff is Curve Lake First Nation, and that's about an hour from Toronto. So this isn't just about any one issue, but certainly the overwhelming pervasive issue is the fact that if this was the case, that Mississauga or Toronto or Hamilton or Victoria or any major metropolitan city in this country had this level of drinking water problem, it would not be tolerated.
So why do we allow it to exist? Why does it continue to exist?
Because it's easier to ignore Indigenous people, because they make up about 5% of Canada versus people who have a lot more ability to influence the Canadian government, like people like you and me. I mean, we both have platforms that a lot of First Nations people don't have.
Let's talk about economic involvement. I've spoken to a couple of people of late that have said that one of the best ways to bring some of the Indigenous groups out of poverty and out of problems is to have them actually be partnered in natural resource development or in other economic development opportunities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense and is a really smart way of looking at things. If you look at what we're doing in Ontario right now, all of the transmission lines, Hydro One has said that any transmission line over $10 million, which is any one of major consequence, they're going to offer 50% equity partnership to First Nations in actual ownership of those lines. And it's not just a fantastic gesture. They've got some processes in terms of how they can back that up, but it's actually smart, because what we've seen with some lower mainland BC, Wet'suwet'en, and a couple other communities involving, in that case, pipelines, business has shut down completely. They haven't been able to complete some of these lines as a result of First Nations not being brought in. So if you flip it around and say, how can we involve First Nations? it really opens up a dialogue where it's not we're doing something for you, but we're doing something with you approach. And that's really one of the most important things I think that business people can generally look at is how can we have a level playing field with any of our partners, whether they're Indigenous or not.
So let me ask you for some practical advice here, if I could. I am invited to present to the board of an economic development business that's a part of an Indigenous band in Alberta in January. And I'm going to the board meeting. So I'm not going to the tribal council or anything like that, but I'm going to the board of the economic development. I don't know what you call it, division or department.
Corporation, either public corporations.
Okay. And so what suggestions have you got for me? I'm going to be traveling about 3 hours north of Edmonton. Going to this a Indigenous village and making a presentation. What would be the things that if I hired you to advise me, you would be advising me on?
Sure. So first, understand where the geography of that community is, and what are the opportunities. What is the provincial, federal government looking to achieve? More than likely, there's going to be resource extraction that's going to be of interest to them. There'll be non-Indigenous partners that are going to be looking to work in the natural resource spaces. So what I would do is I would look at who would be interested in partnering with these communities. I would go to the community and say, I have the ability of helping you out by bringing in capital, by bringing in non-Indigenous partners to help create jobs. A hugely overlooked group that is incredibly keen on working with First Nations communities is organized labor, private sector labor. They are actively looking to find ways of growing their member base and providing training to Indigenous communities for a road, a transmission line, forestry projects, or any of that would be something that you can actually bring more partners in. So I would go in with a Rolodex of people that that would be interested in partnering with these communities, and also having access to capital doesn't hurt either.
What about some of the cultural do's or don'ts?
Certainly. I mean, if you're very often going to be invited to have a ceremony in the beginning, one of the most important things is you're probably going to look at bringing a gift. Could be tobacco plus something else, as a way of showing that you have a heart it's very open, and you're focused on building relationships, not just transacting. And I think that's one of the most important things. So when I go into communities, I have ceremonial tobacco that I have as an offering, as well as some other gift that I bring. And this dates back to pre-European times here, where nations, when they would meet each other, the chiefs would exchange things because they would show that they're being genuine. And I think that's the most important thing is show up as being genuine.
Okay. I've heard that a lot of these natural resource developments can get approved far quicker if you end up having Indigenous involvement. Is that good or bad?
Well, I think there's an ideological play sometimes. Some folks that are completely against natural resource development think that any resource development is bad. I would put it back to why are we telling nations what they should be doing with their land? If they want to develop their land and create job opportunities for their members, why are we standing in the way of that? And so, frankly, there is funding available from the federal government for a lot of projects, but some of the projects in the natural resource sector are not being funded because this federal government doesn't allow that. And my perspective is, let the communities make the decision. If it's a good business case and you can prove the business case, then money should flow regardless of what is the sector. And let's not forget, the folks that are probably best at stewarding this land are Indigenous people. They've got a better track record of it than you or me.
I interviewed one person who said the problem right now all stems from the heritage of the Indian Act. Tell me about what the Indian Act says and does and why that would be a potential problem?
Well, the Indian Act confers some rights, and responsibilities for Canada, and it's been an incredibly harmful tool by and large. It prevented Indigenous people from leaving their reserves up until probably 45 years ago. You couldn't hire a lawyer without having approval from an Indian Act agent. And certainly it's kept Indigenous people on reserves and prevented them from actually developing relationships off reserve. So a lot of what we're seeing is, for the first time, probably second and third generations of folks who are Indigenous are able to travel freely. Residential schools there are many people that are still alive that are victims of residential schools. And all of this is tied to an approach, including the Indian Act, that has pushed down and kept Indigenous people stuck. And, simply wiping the slate clean of the Indian Act, we're in the process, I think, right now of shifting it. But we can't just get rid of the Indian Act, because right now there is some benefits to some of the nations as a result of it.
Alex, I really appreciate you joining us and telling us today a little bit about what's going on in regards to Indigenous reconciliation. Are you optimistic about where we're headed in Canada in this regard, or pessimistic?
Well, what I'm seeing is there's a willingness from business leaders to put their money where their mouth is, from the Toronto Stock Exchange to large multinationals to small businesses to not just one political stripe of government. I mean, I understand that the new national chief has already met with Pierre Poilievre, and she's been elected not even a week ago. And that's good news. The fact that we're seeing commitments from every political party and businesses towards economic reconciliation is good news. So I'm a business guy. I'm an entrepreneur. So I tend to skew optimistic on most things. And this is certainly one of them. And the evidence is there too.
Alex Bishop, thank you so much for joining us and talking about your own personal situation, which I think is very helpful for us to understand, and also about your business in Indigenous reconciliation and getting economic development opportunities to our Indigenous communities. I really congratulate you in that regard. We're going to take a break, and I'm going to come back with some of my own thoughts on this topic in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.